Hello, hello, and welcome to Unhoused. I know people will be joining us here over the next few minutes, but I'm just going to begin to honor the early attendees and those who showed up right on time. I never want to delay too long. Thank you for joining us. I think we're going to have quite a group today, gathering virtually. Really delighted you're here for Unhoused. We have a wonderful is not even a good enough word for it. We have an amazing group of panelists. Really excited to bring them back together. We had a fabulous first part of this conversation 2 months ago in September. We're now following up with Michelle Merriweather, with David Wertheimer, with Skelchum Kelmendi, with Asa Tate. In a moment I'll introduce them, and I'm just delighted they're here today. But I'd like to first begin by thanking, we have some people who've made this possible, some companies and individuals who've made this possible today. I want to begin with some gratitude. I want to thank you for joining. And thank you to our presenting sponsor, Seattle Bank. That's new since last time. They've really stepped up in partnership with Wellspring Family Services this year, subsequent to this last Unhoused. And so we're just thrilled that they're our presenting sponsor today. And we have community supporters in Amazon, NetTech, and Microsoft. We're really grateful to each of them. And I thought I'd just introduce myself and say that I'm Peter Drury. It's my honor to serve as Chief Strategy Officer for Wellspring Family Services. And at this moment in time, I'm also the interim director of our housing program while we're in transition in that regard. I'd like to open up with a land and labor acknowledgement before introducing our guests. And I know that other people will be joining us as we come in, so I often like to do that after everyone is here, but I think I'll go ahead and start with our land and labor acknowledgement. I certainly want to honor, as does Wellspring Family Services, the land on which each one of us resides and dwells and walks each day, the nurturance of the water, the rivers, and all that condensation from the sky, the beauty of the flowers that we await in the spring, the warmth of the heat of the sun in the summer, and the beauty of the winter in all of its snow and all of its tumult in the chill that we also find our ways to enjoy. We're grateful for these wonders of nature. And even in particular, we're grateful for the people who through time immemorial have stewarded this land. And in fact, that land was taken from them, and those of us who are on this panel and in the audience and in this community need to all be aware and acknowledge that we're really on borrowed land, and it is our honor to be here. We thank in particular all of the Coast Salish people. I myself am in the land of the Suquamish and the people of the Clear Saltwater, and I'm grateful for their stewardship of this land as well. If you know the land on which you dwell and want to pop it into the chat, you're welcome to put that in the chat. I think that'd be a fabulous thing to do. If you would like to particularly acknowledge the land on which you are, the stewards of the land on which you dwell, that would be fabulous if you know that. If not, you can also look that up. And I also want, as Wellspring does, to acknowledge just the history of labor and forced labor and inequitable economics that have led us to the place in time where we are now with an economy that's been wildly adversely impacted by racism, by injustice, by sexism, by xenophobia, all kinds of things that have led to an economy where people wind up at the extreme at a state of homelessness, a state of being unhoused. So we want to begin today's conversation by thanking in gratitude all of those who've come before us, who've stewarded this land, and we want to acknowledge our role in wanting to heal wounds of the past and moving forward so that we find the day when people actually aren't unhoused, when people are housed, and when we can have the beloved community to which I believe we all aspire. With that, I'd like to welcome our panelists. I'll introduce them one by one, and I will not give great, long, extensive bios because you're going to get to meet them personally through the nature of their comments. I'm going to start with my colleague Asa Tate, who serves on the executive leadership team of Wellspring Family Services. She is our Chief Development Officer and Ambassador Extraordinaire. I will now introduce our colleague and friend Skelchum Kelmendi, who is the founder, Executive Director of Housing Connector, a really critical partner for Wellspring Family Services. I'm eager for you to hear today about his model, hopefully not from my dog barking in the background. I'm not sure if you heard that just now. I may need to mute very soon. But Skelchum is with Housing Connector, critical partner, as I'm saying, and a really innovative model when we talk about solutions to homelessness. I'm really eager for you to hear from him today. Michelle Merriweather, who is a treasured peer and colleague who is the CEO of the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle And Urban League and Wellspring work closely together with a number of partners in this region to really work on solving this problem of homelessness, of the unhoused, and many other corresponding kind of inequities and injustices surrounding it. So welcome, Michelle. Glad you're here. David Wertheimer is retired from a long-time career as an activist, a leader, a teacher in all kinds of fun ways, in important ways. His career spans queer activism, family homelessness activism. He even has connections to the theology and ministry world and has been a leader in housing related solutions for a long, long time. And he retired from his long-standing role with the Gates Foundation recently and is enjoying a little rest and renewal, but ever the activist, he's still going. And he's rocking it in retirement to fight for change. So with those introductions, really so glad each of these panelists are here. I'd like to give them each, I guess I'll remind you all in the audience, that you can submit questions in the chat today at any point. I'm going to try to optimize the time of each of our panelists, and so rather than like popping it out to all of you to ask questions, we have a wonderful team member at Wellspring who's kind of curating and monitoring the chat. We'll bubble up some of those questions. But I want to really, without any further ado, let you get to know each of these fabulous panelists and hear their thoughts about solutions to family homelessness. I will begin by saying something that I said in Unhoused part number 1, which was we have a friend of the organization and a donor in the community who looks at the homelessness crisis, and he said to himself for years, he said, wait, the problem seems like it's getting worse and worse and worse. When I look around, I'm seeing more homelessness than I used to. Does that mean that the solutions aren't working? Does it mean that the nonprofits don't know what they're doing? Does it mean that government doesn't know what it's doing? And if I ever were to donate to anybody, am I just donating to failure, or are there solutions that actually work? That gentleman's first name is John. I won't out him by his last name at this moment. I understand he may be signed on today. So I'm hoping that we're going to kind of answer John's question about, is it the case when we see visible homelessness getting worse that there aren't solutions, or does it maybe mean something else? So with that thought, I'd like to give each of our panelists a moment to just say a word about solutions. I'm going to come back in greater detail. But Skelchum, I'm going to start with you. I'm going to ask you, again, this is kind of high level intro, but let's start with you. Are you seeing solutions out there? Can you give us a high level sense of that?
Yeah, Peter, I think, at its core, there are lots of solutions. And one thing to remind folks, because I think sometimes it can seem really bleak, is, we are ending homelessness for thousands of individuals every week and every year. But the part of the problem is the outflow, the folks that we are able to help get out of the current situation and into permanent housing, unfortunately, is not outpacing the number of people falling into homelessness. And so this is where it gets to be a much more complex conversation, because yes, we can focus on the problem which is right in front of us, which is how do we get folks that are on the street or in shelters and families into units and then keep them there. But I think then there's the other aspect of the question, Peter, which is how do we prevent folks from falling into homelessness? And I think, when we all last gathered, David mentioned a lot of things that are cause homelessness, for the inequities, in the economy and in the criminal system, lots of different areas and causes for homelessness. But I think from my perspective, we are seeing solutions. But part of my issue, and I'll just be frank with you all, is sometimes the politics get in the way of the solution. And we as a community have a lot of people who are really well-intentioned trying to do this work. And sometimes we don't see eye to eye. And I think our politics and our focus on arguing and debating and maybe working around the edges is keeping some of the meaningful work from actually moving forward. And I'd love to touch on this a little later, but that's why I'm really excited about the new Regional Homelessness Authority, because my hope is that now that we have a centralized body that is bringing us all together and hopefully rowing in the same direction, we can start putting some of those politics and disagreements aside and actually focus on the people that we're here to serve. So I am hopeful, but I think we still have work to do here to make sure that we are not losing sight of why we're doing this work.
Thank you, Skelchum. And I love that image of rowing in the right direction, kind of in alignment all together, rowing in the same direction. I'm wondering, Michelle Merriweather, when you think about different organizations in town and different programs in town, are we starting to row in the right direction? What are you seeing? Are you feeling encouraged by some solutions out there?
Yeah, it's great to be here with you all again, first of all. And I appreciate just at the work that everybody on this screen is doing and advocating for. And many of us in community that are not here are doing tremendous work and have been for years. Most of which has been tremendously under-resourced, under-supported, but the intent and mission are there. When we help a family, it is a celebration. That family is being housed and hopefully permanently. And there are, Urban League, Wellspring, Mary's Place, the list goes on of organizations that are Plymouth Housing, et cetera, that are doing tremendous work each and every day and have been for years when the crisis was still a crisis, but maybe not as visible or as bad. And I think now with the presence of COVID and our political climate and many other issues, things are certainly rising to the top and to the surface and are certainly more visible. But that has not stopped the work and the energy of the service providers to do this work. And yes, I am so hopeful of the regional authority and the work and the intent that they're set forth to do. I'm also hopeful in a collaboration of both business, community, and civic leaders in the regional partners group that is also rowing in the same direction to match the efforts of the government sector and the regional authority. So for the first time in a long time, or if ever, we are truly starting to come together in the same direction. I think what we need to also be mindful of is that while we want this to go away overnight, it wasn't created overnight. And so it will take time, but we also have to ensure that we do, as Skelton said, put politics aside and allow those entities to do the work, to take the lead, and to make sure that they're properly resourced. All of us are properly resourced to scale this work and do it as efficiently as possible and certainly as quickly as possible.
Thank you. And in fact, Michelle, since both you and Skelchum have mentioned the regional authority, I'll make sure just for our audience, so people understand what's happened. For years, the city of Seattle and King County as a county have operated differently with different sets of funds, different strategies, different measurements, different metrics, and it's not made us effective in a unified way. And so what Skelchum and Michelle are each referring to, that'll probably come up a bit in this conversation, is that there's, for the first time ever, going into January 1st of the coming year, there's actually the unified operations of the Regional Housing Authority. It's been in formation over the last couple of years. Exciting new leadership who we're thrilled about. I'm sure that in a future Unhoused program, we're going to be eager to bring them to this conversation. I know from each of our organizations, we've been in lots of meetings with them, and we're really excited about the spirit and the vision, the energy of both Mark Dones and Peter Lynn and others involved in that team. But that's what we're referring to when we say the regional authority, is that combined effort. I'm going to turn to David Wertheimer and ask you as well. Are you encouraged about solutions, or when you look and see visible homelessness out there, do you think, oh gosh, everybody's failing? What do you think, David?
Well, I'm going to join with Michelle and Skelchum in saying that I actually do feel optimistic because the research tells us what works. We know what works. What works is housing first. Housing first. And then, without any strings attached to it, without anything other than housing, it works. And then once the housing is in place, to voluntarily offer services and supports to individuals or families that may help them to continue the process of moving towards stability and self-sufficiency. We know this works. The challenge is that it's not cheap. It's much less expensive than everything we're spending money on right now in the criminal justice system and in the shelter system. Permanent housing is actually less expensive than shelter. Permanent housing is less expensive than prison. And yet in our society, because of the polarization that we're experiencing right now politically, it's very difficult to create a sense of unity around what we need to do. And this is not a red issue, it's not a blue issue, it's a human issue. And what we really need to do is to challenge the intense polarization that we're facing right now politically and in our society, and say, we have to do this together. And we can do this together if we prioritize the resources we need to make it happen. Period.
Awesome, thank you. And Asa Tate, as our fourth panelist, I want to invite you the same. I know you've got some unique perspectives on this as well, about solutions that work and ending the cycle. What do you have to tell us, Asa?
First, I just want to thank everyone for being here today. Everyone on this screen is a wonderful partner of ours. And why am I in the position of following David? But I agree with everything that everyone has said. And I'll just bring one more piece into the puzzle, which is the generational nature of homelessness. You know, to Michelle's point, we didn't get here overnight, and we're not going to get out of it overnight. And our Wellspring's mission is to end the cycle of family homelessness. And often a piece of the pie within the family dynamic that's left behind are the children. And we're really focused on children, youth, and families as a unit and trying to keep that unit together and thriving. So at the heart of our approach, you know, we believe in the wraparound approach. And at the heart of that is our early learning center. And studies have shown that children who have experienced homelessness once are 30% more likely to experience it again. And it only grows exponentially with each experience of homelessness. And we'd like to stop that at the root. Our early learning center has been around for about 30 plus years. And it might be interesting for those watching to know that from what we've been able to research, it is the only such facility, the only early learning center statewide exclusively focused on meeting the needs of children who have experienced homelessness. And their needs are at a higher level than some of their peers. And as a result, our program is trauma informed. It's focused on children ages 1 to 5. We want them to become kindergarten and life ready and successful. And we also want to support their parents and their caregivers. So we have family support specialists that are there to help create a plan for success and long-term stability for families, and making sure they have access to all of our programs, both internal to Wellspring and external, because our partners play a key role in providing access to resources that we may not have. And we want to ease that navigation for families. So we make sure they have access to our free store. They can get essentials, whether it be diapers, wipes, or clothing or beyond. We want to make sure they have access to our housing team, whether it's keeping people housed, to the point made earlier, it's much more cost effective in keeping people in community, or locating affordable housing with the help of folks like Skelchum and his team at Housing Connector. So we're really looking at the family as a unit, and we want to make sure that children and youth are not being left behind as part of the equation.
Thank you. Love the 2 thumbs up too, that's good. Michelle, you have a team that's on the ground all the time, you know, working with families experiencing homelessness. I asked you a little bit about what encourages you. Are there specific programs at the Urban League right now that your team is really saying, hey, this is where we got to focus to make the greatest, you know, to have the greatest impact?
There's a few, but the one I will raise up right now is our safe lots. There are a lot of people that are living in cars and going to work every day and going to sleep in their car. And we have been able to work with several churches to open up their parking lots and their churches as a resource to folks, so they can have a safe shelter and safe harbor. And not only are they in a safe place and can sleep a little more safely, we're able to build a genuine relationship with them and transfer them from sleeping in some place that is not meant for human dwelling to someplace more permanent and more stable. And if that means, you know, helping them find a better job, helping them find a place that they can afford, addressing the issues that that got them in the situation in the first place, through genuine relationship, we're able to transform their lives and at least put them in a journey on the pathway to doing something more permanent for their life. And so I would say the safe lot is one. I think that the other one that I will just raise up, there are a lot of teens and young adults that are having the same experiences. And we have a drop-in center right in the heart of the Central District where they can come and get a good meal, talk to someone, identify what their needs are as well. and without judgment or hesitation. And I will just end with the fact that everyone that is doing this work on our team, one is very passionate about ending the cycle of homelessness for the person that is right in front of them, and building that genuine connection. But many of them also have that heart and that passion because they've had that lived experience, because somebody else did that for them, and because it is just with heart and passion that they come to this work. So those are the two. Again, we're doing so many other things. I can go on, but those are the two I'd lift up right now.
That's awesome. Thank you. And we will circle back. I'll be asking you more. I want to apologize first and foremost. I understand from the chat that there has been some difficulty with people accessing this session. I think there was a broken link that went out in the email, unfortunately. I'm just so impressed always with the team who supports something like this. And no matter how you slice it or dice it, there's always some technological glitch, unfortunately, so it happened to us today. So on behalf of Wellspring, I want to apologize for the difficulty. I still want to thank the remarkable people supporting this behind the scenes. And yes, indeed, we're recording this session, so we'll be able to make it available to you afterward to not miss anything at all. I want to ask Skelchum, to pick up a little bit on where Michelle just headed, and some comments, Skelchum, you made earlier about kind of the things that get in the way. One of these dicey topics that those of us who work in the system know, that people who are donors or volunteers or just the general public kind of paying attention don't necessarily know, is there's a really important difference between when funding is restricted and funding is flexible. There's a difference between when a government body or a philanthropist says, oh, okay, you can only spend money on this and this and this, and then we wind up doing this really funny budgeting process and cash flow gets difficult. And I'm wondering if you can talk about flexible funding. And it's not just, because it's not just we're just saying like, gee, give us money because we're not sure what we'll do with it. It's actually, there's a different reason for flexible funding. I'm wondering if you can comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I despise when there's all these strings attached to the funding. And here's why. Whoever's giving that funding, and it might be good intent, in some ways you're signaling that you know better than that organization and how that funding should be utilized or how you want it to be utilized. And there's certain things and certain times where the funding, yes, should be like this funding needs to go towards youth, or it needs to be in this geography because of whatever federal restrictions. But I think one of the issues there is that it really handcuffs an organization from doing and meeting the needs of the folks that they're there to serve and the customers. And instead, oftentimes what we see with nonprofits is they start focusing more on how do we meet this grant or these restrictions on this funding instead of focusing on the mission. And I think this is just an issue that we see across the system. First of all, the fact that we have nonprofits is already problematic, but that's a bigger problem because we're solving problems that our government should be solving and frankly shouldn't exist. But one of the things that then it does is for nonprofits, what we see is often we see scope creep because a nonprofit is having to meet a certain requirement of a fund because they need that funding to survive and support their staff instead of, again, being able to focus on the mission. So from my perspective, I think it's a really challenging and problematic aspect. If folks are there and if you're giving, and I think about the organizations that I donate to, first I do my research and make sure that the work that they're doing aligns with my focus and what I think should be happening. And then I donate and I trust that they're going to do it. And I think there's that aspect that for us that are giving, like, yes, do your homework, yes, do your research, but then have a little faith and trust that organizations, once you do that, to be the best steward of that funding. And then reevaluate in a year, reevaluate in 2 years, see did they actually come through. But putting those restrictions, you're already setting them back to be able to achieve maybe the goal that you had in the first place.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask a follow-up, David, of you. I want to frame it up just a little bit. I mean, you worked for a long time for the Gates Foundation, who obviously, as we all know, put a lot of money into analyzing family homelessness, investing in solutions of family homelessness. And, for a group who had to make really big financial decisions and strategic decisions about philanthropy relative to family homelessness, it would be really helpful for the at-large donors in the community out there to know, what did the Gates Foundation learn about that? Is Skelchum off his rocker, or is he actually speaking to something really important? And can you also add in, David, a little bit about client voice? Because this flexible fund conversation is so deeply connected to being able to actually honor the intentions and the expertise of those people who are, who we say that we're serving, but are we really? Could you pick up on that?
Sure, it's a really great question. And I want to come back to something both that Skelchum said and that Michelle said. Flexible funding is, I think, at the Gates Foundation, one of the most important things we did in the family homelessness arena. Because without that flexible funding, many families face a crisis that they can't deal with. For example, I'll give you just one story of how flexible funding worked so well. There was a family in King County, I won't say where, and the husband and the wife together ran a food truck. And the stove in their food truck broke. They needed $350 to fix the stove in their food truck. There was no government funding support to fix a food truck stove. But without that food truck stove, the family would have lost their housing because that was their source of income. So the grantee that received, one of the grantees that received flexible funding from the Gates Foundation, no strings attached, used this funding however it is going to help families, gave that family a grant of $350. They fixed their stove in their food truck and they avoided becoming homeless. Period. $350 to keep a family out of homelessness, as opposed to the tens of thousands of dollars it costs to have them be homeless. So yes, flexible funding, I think, is one of the most important things that we can do. And the second thing I want to come back to is it's two words that Michelle said that I think are two of the most important words that have been uttered so far today. And those two words are without judgment. Mm-hmm. Incredibly important, Michelle. Thank you for that. And I'll just say one story that highlights that. This goes back to 2005 when I was on the board of the Downtown Emergency Service Center. And we were about to open, well, this was actually before that, 2003-04, we were planning something called the 1811 Project, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's a program for chronically, individuals with chronic substance use disorders who are living on the street. And the theory was, this was one of the first Housing First programs in Seattle, that if we provided housing to people who were chronically living on the streets and addicted to alcohol, that they actually might benefit. And we went to Ron Sims, who was the county executive at the time, amazing Ron Sims, and we said, hey, we want to do this wet housing project called the 1811 for the most severely, the folks who are going through jail, detox, homelessness shelters, and we want to give them permanent housing. And Ron said, well, we can't really do wet housing. And so we said, well, what if we call it pre-recovery housing? And Ron said, oh, I really like that. Yes, let's go do pre-recovery housing. So we took this model for pre-recovery housing and built the 1811 and found the 96 most severely, the most expensive to the system in terms of detox, jail, shelter, people living on the streets who were chronically using alcohol. And we put them in the 1811. What happened? They became, most of them found for the first time in sometimes decades, community, fellowship, and sobriety. Housing first. Michelle, you're right, without judgment. And Ron was like, pre-recovery housing works, yay. Yeah, people can call it whatever they want. It works.
That's perfect. Thank you. Couldn't agree more. And I'm seeing lots of shout outs in the chat, and I'm feeling all the shout outs myself. I mean, I think these conversations about without judgment, housing first, flexible funding, and certainly client voice. I want to kind of land there for a moment and make that transition. As I do, darn, I just had a thought and it just left my brain. Maybe it'll come back. But when it comes to client voice, Asa, I'm going to turn to you because we serve a lot of families at Wellspring. We encounter them in lots of different ways. And what are some of the things that we're learning, that you're hearing that we're learning from clients in terms of, what they need as opposed to what we think they need?
Yeah, I want to just piggyback onto the conversation we're already having. I think the client is the expert. Those who have been through this or are going through this, I call it lived expertise, not experience. And we have to lean into that expertise. Those who are in the struggle know what it takes to get out of the struggle. And some of those might be the families we're serving. And sometimes it's the voices of folks on our staff who have previously experienced this themselves. And I think we would be remiss to not be informed by the clients as opposed to those who have never ever experienced any of this trying to prescribe needs. It reminds me a lot of working in food banking many, many decades ago, and the idea of handing someone a bag filled with food versus letting someone pick out what it is they need that's going to best meet the needs of their family and actually be utilized. This also goes to the importance of flexible funding. What family A may need is very different from what family B may need. But David's example about the broken stove couldn't have been more perfect, as I've been in conversations with our housing team and we talk about the priorities for what flexible funding can do. It's often a car repair. It's a $300 to $500 car repair, which is the difference between being able to get to work or not. And then if you can't get to work, you find yourself in a situation where you're having to come up with first, last deposit, and that's a huge barrier for people that's insurmountable. So the client voice should always be centered. We do our best at Wellspring to center the client voice, as well as centering diversity, equity, and inclusion. We really want to be trauma informed in how we're going to serve people, and we want to not assume that we know best, but allow them to be leaders in shaping the vision that will provide the best solutions. And I feel as though that same approach is happening in spades at the regional authority. And I'm so thrilled for this new group coming together with the leaders that they have put together on their, I think it's an advisory council and board with, lived expertise, as opposed to a bunch of politicians who maybe were never, ever homeless, right?
Exactly. Exactly. We're really fortunate at Wellspring, and we're trying to raise this conversation more and more in the philanthropy environment. But we're, and this is not a plug. It's just, I'm just being honest. Starbucks has been a partner with us for a long time with a very flexible sense of where we can place that money, which has been amazing. And that flexibility has frankly been able to help us in the very situations that we're talking about right now, the occasional car repair, somebody getting a license for a job renewed so they can go back to work. There's no government contract that's going to pay for someone to do that, but because we've been in a position to augment what we're doing, for example, for a government contract, thanks to philanthropy, we can do that. So Starbucks and Seattle Bank, who's our sponsor today, is doing exactly that with Wellspring. The Puyallup tribes recently made a wonderful gift for our work in Pierce County, so we could do that in Tacoma and the surrounding area. It's thrilling when a grantor, a donor comes along and says, look, I really want this money to go to the most important place, and that's frankly for the client to self-determine kind of what they need and have the extra guidance and support of Wellspring. So that's not a plug at all. It's actually a programmatic comment that our social workers on the front lines know that when they can respond to what a client needs in the moment, because a philanthropist was, strategic in advance to say, I want money to be there when the person needs it for what they need it for. That's a beautiful thing, and our social workers really appreciate that. Michelle, go ahead.
I just want to add one more thing about why flexible funding is so important and unrestricted operating funding is so important, because I don't want to lose sight of the staff working at all of our organizations. They too often are on the margins, and we need to make sure that we keep them out of becoming homeless. So it's on both sides of the coin. And thank you for lifting up our supporters, but I also want to lift up our teams doing this important work.
Thank you. I'm so glad you said that. Absolutely. Michelle, I want to turn to you for a second. When we've talked in advance of this and just over the last few years working together, I often hear you refer to just the importance of authentic relationships, and that, we can talk about homelessness as this idea that's in the newspapers versus actually meeting real people with real needs and real hopes and real dreams. And I think that when I think about a question like this, which is, how can we solve homelessness? We can stop thinking about the people one by one by one. When David just told us those stories that he did, we were thinking about individual people. And I'd love for you to share with us some of your thoughts about the authentic relationships, the stories you're hearing, and how we can think about this crisis on a kind of a one by one, family by family kind of a situation, as opposed to some general headline in the Seattle Times.
Yeah, unfortunately, lately, especially, our friends and neighbors that are living unhoused and experiencing homelessness are now a problem to be solved for, in many cases in the name of public safety or something like that, as opposed to, this is my neighbor that is experiencing a crisis for whatever reason and is forced to live in a tent on the street or in their car or somebody's couch or a shelter. Uh, and instead of listening to their individual story or supporting their struggle or ensuring they have the resources that they need to go to work or to fix the stove to keep their house, we kind of start to put everybody in a group or a box or a bunch and try to check boxes, check we got them into a shelter, check we got them into an apartment, without thinking about how they're going to sustain that apartment, what got them in the position they're in the first place. And we learned this through supporting our brothers and sisters that are exiting incarceration. And doing that work and trying to prevent them from going back. Until we address the underlying conditions, there's going to be a big chance that we're going to experience this again. And so if we're going to address and support you on a pathway to sufficiency, to a house that you can afford on good terms, that is safe, et cetera, you all know what we're looking for. We have to understand authentically what got them there, what their needs are. We can't prescribe it to them. We have to understand and have a team of people that are doing this work, that are sensitive to that, listening to that, and connecting to that, and not just trying to check a box. And that, again, goes back to why that flexible funding is so important, because many of the systems just want us to check the box and move on to something else. But we need the true wraparound services to address the whole being, the whole family, so that we can make sure that they're on a pathway to be successful.
Thank you. In a moment, I'm going to turn to Saida on our team, who's been watching the chat. I know lots of great questions coming up in the chat, so I'll ask her in just a moment. But I want to just kind of pull this back together in terms of just weaving some threads of what I'm hearing. I mean, whether we're talking about kind of innovative solutions, I love this thing about church parking lots providing safe spaces, for example. Housing Connector is really encouraging. I'm making it possible for landlords to overcome barriers really that are perceptions and fears, so that they're willing to rent properties to people who need them. David's comments and really reinforced by everybody about housing first, and just like, let's get people into housing. We know it works. Got to make that happen. And also this overarching theme that it's way less expensive and it's way less traumatic and it's just less cruel, for people to not fall into homelessness in the first place. Like, let's get ahead of this thing. Just like preventative medicine, it's way better to have our checkups and stay healthy and pursue wellness than to wind up, sick, expensive, tired, and, and injured. It just isn't necessary. So I want to pull those together to say that I'm hearing this panel talk about that there really are solutions. They really are working, but Skelchum kind of framed it up by saying that if we might be solving homelessness family by family by family, individual by individual by individual, but when you look at the aggregate, if the inflow into homelessness is much bigger and faster than the outflow out of it, then that's why the public gets this perception like, wow, we have a big problem, right? But instead, we actually are having successful outflow, but it can't keep pace with the ever-growing inflow. Now, having said that, I want to turn to Saida because I know great questions are coming up in the chat, and the panelists will be able to answer these far better than I. So let's hear what we've got, Saida, and let's see which panelist might want to respond to which question.
Great. Hello, everyone. So this question looks like a two-parter, and this is for David. Here we go. So how open is philanthropy to providing ongoing flexible funding to nonprofits for this? Often foundations want to invest in a couple years to test out an idea, but then have government or others take over for the ongoing funding. Do you see a world where philanthropy continues to supplement more rigid funding from government?
It's a great question. And I'll start with the second part and go back to the first. I think that the dollars that philanthropy bring to the issue of homelessness, or really almost any issue in the United States, is surprisingly a tiny fraction of the dollars that are actually being used for these issues when you look at all the government funding in homelessness, for example, that's spent by Housing and Urban Development at the federal level, HHS, public housing authorities, correctional systems that are, I mean, it's a philanthropy is a drop in the bucket. And my perspective about philanthropic dollars has always been that it's the role of philanthropy to take the high risks and to test the things that we don't yet know if they work, but let's see if they do. Because when you work in government, and I spent 10 years working for King County, you are, entrusted with these public dollars, and you have to pay for what you know works, because you can't really take the kind of risks you can take when you're spending Bill and Melinda Gates' money, for example. You can take a lot of risks because they say, go take a risk, go find something new that works. Once you find what works, in this instance, for example, flexible funding, it then becomes the role of advocacy and of community to convince government, look, this works. We need to take the massive amount of dollars that government is currently spending to, for example, incarcerate people, and instead provide flexible funding that keeps families together and families housed. What if we were to do that? And so I think that yes, philanthropy needs to continue to innovate, needs to continue to invest in testing out new theories. But once we know what works, government should take it to scale. That's government's job. And when we're not doing that, we are failing as a society. And I'll just cap this by saying, from my perspective, housing is a human right. And we have to ensure that government acknowledges that it's a human right. And we have to behave and act in that way as well.
Thank you, David. Saida, are there more questions?
No more questions. Just a lot of great comments.
Oh, good.
Can I build off of what David said, Peter? One thing to build off of what David said. I think one of my frustrations sometimes here locally is, we've had a homeless crisis for how many years now? We've declared it a crisis. And honestly, we haven't acted like it's a crisis. Think about last year when COVID hit and how quickly we all mobilized, got on the same team, and made a difference. We acted, we moved things along that often would have taken years in government to do so. And I'm always left wondering, why do we not have that same attitude and urgency around homelessness? Because we're calling it a crisis, but we're not acting like it's a crisis. And to David's point, we, government at some point, we have to push them to say, look, the money that is there is designed for the people that are experiencing homelessness. And we have to try and get it out the door to make sure it's actually getting there. Is some of it going to maybe be a lesson learned or not work? Absolutely. But the status quo is also not acceptable. And so taking a risk has to be a part of this. And oftentimes those restrictions kind of goes back to the unrestricted funding piece. Some of the restrictions that often come down with the federal funding actually has caused this city to have to send money back, money that was designed for homelessness, but is so restrictive that we've had to send back millions of dollars back to the federal government because there's just no way that they could figure out how to use it. So there's just a lot of issues here, but kind of goes down to what Michelle said in the beginning, which is we have to let the experts lead, and for the city government and politicians to say, how do we help? Not necessarily how do we be the ones to be out front on this. And I think that's something that I'm, again, hopeful will change in the attitudes of this community over the next year.
Thank you, Skelsham. Totally agree. I understand from Saida there might be another question.
Yes. This one isn't directed to anyone specifically, but the question is, are there issues with competition between social service agencies for funding, which contributes to a fragmented approach?
Aha. I would tell you what, I'm going to start with that one, but I think everybody here might have some angle at answer. For the person, to the casual observer, it's very easy to observe and say, oh gosh, why are all these nonprofits in competition? Which I think actually misunderstands the economy a little bit. So for example, in this call right now, Asa and I, who work at Wellspring, are together with Michelle Merriweather at the Urban League and Skelton Kelmendi at Housing Connector, who, if you were on the outside world out there, you'd say, aren't they competitors? And I just want to ask Michelle personally directly, do we compete with each other?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. We complement each other. We support each other. We partner. if we start to believe that this is a competition, the only loss is those we serve. That's it.
Thank you. And I want to ask Skelton the same. Skelton, do we compete with each other?
Peter, so no, we don't compete, but sometimes the system makes us compete.
Exactly.
And I think that's sometimes the problem, right? Like, there's a grant, and again, everyone has to kind of go at it and go after it. So sometimes it does create competition. Competition is not bad, though, like in the sense of like you should have the best organization or the individual that can provide the best service rise to the top. But I think sometimes the way things have been set up, it does create that fragmentation in our community. And I do think that that's a problem that has to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. I'd say that, I've heard this term emerge among some peers, maybe you all have heard this too, collaboration, which is to say that we are mostly collaborative, probably 80-90% of the time, and maybe 10% of the time, sure. I mean, to Skelcham's point, there might be a grant proposal or government contract that we're vying for, but the truth is, I mean, for those of you who don't follow philanthropy as closely as some of the people on this call, you'll have a grantor who's giving $10,000 grants. And maybe 11 organizations apply for them. So maybe 10 of them get them and one doesn't. That's different than a grantor giving $100,000 to only one group and excluding the other 10. And so a lot of times we apply for the same grant that Urban League that you apply for, and we both get it, right? But the other thing to know is that even regardless of that funding, we intentionally, all of our organizations, we design our programming to be complementary. None of us wants to duplicate each other. After a grant is awarded, we try to see how we can dovetail and optimize between organizations. And it's true, certainly some part of the time there can be competition, but I think Skelcham makes a critical point. For the really, I think, educated critic of the philanthropic, I call it the philanthro-industrial complex, but for the educated critic of that, you could say, yeah, is the question that nonprofits are competitive, or is a question that philanthropy creates a competitive dynamic? And so I think if philanthropists are fans of collaboration, if they're fans of non-duplication, if they're fans of innovation, they can actually fund stuff that's not going to be competitive and duplicative. But there is a system out there that creates competition, so we navigate it. I guess that's all I'll say about that. David or Asa, do you have comments on this nonprofit cooperation competition topic?
No, I've had the pleasure of seeing much more cooperation in all of my years as a fundraiser, no matter where I've worked. I've even had the pleasure of seeing folks say, this grant is a wonderful opportunity, but this other organization's better positioned to do this work. Let's go send this to them. And we know they don't have a grant writer, so let's help them write it so that these folks can get served. It's not about putting money necessarily in our bank. It's about serving the community. And when I heard this question, the first thing I thought is that particular attendee might be in more of a scarcity mindset, whereas I'm really always trying to stay in an abundance mindset. We live in one of the wealthiest regions in our nation, and if we can just rally folks to invest their dollars in the work that we're doing so that we aren't so underfunded, to Michelle's point earlier, I think we can all do just that much more together.
Wonderful. David?
And Peter, if I could just say, sorry, I just wanted to confirm that what Asa just said, and I'll speak from direct experience as far as how good Wellspring is doing that. When our organization, Housing Connector, was getting started, Peter and the rest of the Wellspring team literally took us under their wings to say, okay, here is the funding landscape. Here are things we can connect you to. Here are introductions we can make to funders. And so to that point, I've seen that firsthand from how Wellspring operates and really appreciated it. And it's allowed us as an organization to be able to thrive and grow because of the connections and the generosity of the Wellspring team.
Thank you. I'm honored by that. Thanks. David, did you have a comment you were going to weigh in on or no?
Yeah, just quickly, and this is something I may have mentioned in our first call, the first conference call that we did a couple months ago. But it may look from the outside like there are all these different providers that are duplicating each other's services, but in fact, many of the agencies that are operating in our communities have very specialized roles and very specialized clientele they're focused on, and very specialized services that they're offering. And the challenge is, how do you help the family, for example, in need, to find the right fit in the agencies that are out there that can help them? And that's where the concept of coordinated entry came into play, because when we started the work in family homelessness in 2006, the research that we did through Westat and the amazing team there told us that the average mostly single mom, because those are the people who had families predominantly that are homeless, had to make 45 phone calls before she could find the right fit for her family in the system in King County. But what happens when you create a coordinated entry system so that all of those provider agencies that are doing very specialized services in different geographies or with different constituencies or with different communities are actually united together in figuring out who's the right agency for this family? Then you make one phone call. Now you have to have the capacity in the system to help the families that are in there, and we talked about this last time as well, the inflow and the outflow. But I don't see. I think that the system that's out there, even though it may not look that way from the outside looking in, is a highly cooperative system, and we just need the mechanical equipment and the grease across all of those agencies to get them working together as effectively as possible.
Thank you. I really appreciate that from each of you. I understand from Saida there may be some more questions, so let me jump into those. Saida, are you there?
Yep. We have a question from Catherine. Catherine asks, I'd like to hear more from the panelists about moving from complacency to urgency in this crisis. That's been going on for so long without real results. Will the new city government players make a difference? Other shifts the panelists see?
Let me open that up. Who'd like to jump in? Moving from complacency to urgency and solutions to this long-standing crisis. We've been talking about that a bit so far, but maybe let's take that a little farther.
I'll just say, to Scoutcham's point earlier, I think those of us working on these issues have always seen it as a crisis, and we're working as hard as we can to get families housed. It breaks our heart to be involved with contracts where you might have to tell the family, actually, you know what, you're going to have to sleep outside 2 nights before we can serve you, because those are the conditions of this contract. So that is as urgent as can be, as far as I'm concerned. And while the community at large may not be in that same space with us, we do hope they'll join us and understand and get on this train. So.
And again, I'll just add that I am certainly hopeful that the King County Regional Homeless Authority will have truly the authority to shift the practices regardless of who is in office. While I do think we have, we will have great representation in our political leaders, I think that it is time we remove the politics out of this crisis and let folks, one, that are doing the work and have the lived expertise, as Asa referred to it, which I love, lead the solutions. We also have to make sure that the authority, the partners group, those of us that are doing the work are fortified and able to do it. And then you'll truly see change.
Thank you. Saida, are we getting some more questions coming in?
Yep, we do. We have one from Trevor. Going back to David and Skelcham's points about how important it is for us to convince government to utilize flexible funding and take it to scale, what is currently being done on that front? Are there any specific organizations or movements within King County or Washington pursuing this main goal? And how can the community get involved and mobilize?
Well, there's a lot in that question. David, a lot of your work with building changes comes to mind, I think. Could you maybe frame a little bit of that up?
Sure. And here's where, I'm it's such a complicated question, but it's such an essential question. I think that let me say several things, and this may come out wrong, but let me try it.
Good.
I think we have to move our collective response to the experience of homelessness from the political realm to a much deeper, either humanistic or even spiritual realm. We have to acknowledge that when we close our eyes to the tents we drive by on I-5, and Diane just said it in the chat, empathy and compassion. That's exactly it. Empathy and compassion. We have to stop ourselves from thinking this is someone else's problem, that this is someone else's family, that this is someone else's community. It's our family. It's our community. It's our problem. And it's a lot easier when you're a politician to say, well, you know, just put that off to the side. But if we think about the needs and the experiences of people experiencing homelessness from this empathy and compassion and spiritual dimension, we're all in this together. And that's the only way we're going to solve this crisis. If we acknowledge that this is something we share collectively, and it's our collective responsibility to do something about it.
Thank you, David. And I couldn't agree more. And I pick up on that and just say that, you know, I notice that when people debate and talk about kind of what's in the public view around homelessness, whether it's in the newspapers or the nightly news or it's in politics, there are an awful lot of people who are upset about homelessness because it's an aesthetic problem, right? They don't like to look at it, right? Which is different than for those of us who are working in the sector, and Asa was calling out staff earlier, who day in and day out are motivated because there are human beings who are suffering, which is very different than saying there's an ugliness problem in my city. Instead, there are human beings who are suffering, and we're a part of a community together who needs to not, who don't believe in a society that creates that problem. And in addition to that, what's visible about homelessness, I mean, the data bears this out. The homelessness that people see visibly is probably a fifth of homelessness, right? I mean, there's 5 times as much, you know, that you don't see. There's students, children, families who are hiding. They're not underneath the bridge or at the I-5 or I-90 exit ramp. You know, they're trying to stay safe, maybe doubling up for a night or two with another family or you know, hiding in their car or whatever else. What people are seeing is the tip of an iceberg. And if they're concerned about it because it's ugly, because it's an aesthetic problem, that's exactly the opposite, David, of what you're describing about a human and spiritual kind of response to this crisis. So I want to encourage everybody that I think that's underneath this issue of from complacency to urgency, is taking seriously, you know, that our neighbors, our friends, our collective beloved community and family are suffering. So absolutely. Did another of you want to weigh in on that too, or should we go to the next and final question? I am going to ask Saida to give us the final question. Choose a good one, Saida.
Yes, final question. Here we go. What happened to the anticipated date for ending homelessness in King County? When I got involved in this effort 13 years ago, the goal was to end homelessness in 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what happened was that it sounds nice. Let's just call a spade, right? And we always get mostly politicians coming together and saying, hey, I'm going to end homelessness. We're going to end homelessness. And usually it's within their term or maybe a couple of years after their term. And the truth is, again, this is where you have to have the experts leading. And I think about this, our response to COVID. If we have the media pundits or the politicians leading our response to COVID, think about how much of a worse position we would be. You have to let the experts lead and have the folks who are making these bold claims around we'll end it in 5 years or 10 years fall in line, because look, we're not going to end it in 10 years. Like, I think that's just the truth. There's still going to be homelessness in our community because of all the other things we talked about, the inequities in our entire system, in our community, in our country. And so we have to get realistic, but we can work towards ending it and addressing a lot of the issues by building more affordable housing, getting better services, making sure we have a mental health system that actually supports the individuals that are in our community that need that. But I think, in my perspective, that's my frustration doing this work, is we are boots on the ground doing the hard work. And then oftentimes we hear sound bites coming from politicians that make it a lot difficult for the folks to actually like follow through with the things we're doing. So I think that's where it comes from. And somebody thought it sounded nice to say we're going to end it in 10 years without probably listening to the experts. But maybe I sound a little bit pessimistic about it.
No, I do think that's absolutely right. And, Also, you think about that span of time. Like, I remember when that was proclaimed, and I remember at the time thinking, like, wow, it was nice to hear. That was a bold aspiration. But I'll tell you, homelessness is different than it was back then. The wealthy are way wealthier than they were back then. The poor are much poorer than they were back then. The disparities have only increased since then. So things have changed since the day when people made those political proclamations as well. And I'm really with Skelchum that, I think about, I look on who's attending this call from all kinds of collaborating organizations. I'm so appreciative that they've joined us. I think about the organizations kind of represented among the panelists here. And I would say the staffs of these organizations, to Ace's point earlier, are working so tirelessly and dedicatedly day in and day out every single day. And one of the most discouraging things you can do is hear politicians or people in the media, kind of lambast, oh, why isn't this over yet? When you have people that are working their hearts out every single day, ending homelessness, family by family, household by household, making solutions work that really are working. And so if some people would pay attention, get to know whether it's Wellspring, whether it's Urban League, whether it's Housing Connector, whether it's many of the organizations who are part of this really important sector fighting homelessness together, get involved. Find out from a particular organization. You won't be competing. If you leave this call today and you get involved with Housing Connector or Urban League, Wellspring isn't disappointed. We're excited, right? If you learn about Solid Ground or neighborhood house or building changes or other, the YWCA, and you get involved, we're not disappointed. We're excited. We all need to be in this together. So I want to thank our panelists for collaborating today, for giving up their time, for volunteering to be here. I want to thank those of you who joined us today. We're just thrilled that you could join this call. And I especially want to just apologize once again. There were some technical difficulties in the beginning, but this has been recorded and you're definitely able to see this again in full from the very beginning. And I want to thank Seattle Bank, who was the premier sponsor of this event today, the presenting sponsor. We're just so grateful. And community supporters like Microsoft, NetTech, and Amazon, thank you so much. And just thank you all for joining this conversation. And I'm just going to say their names out loud, and I guess you can't shout out, on the Zoom, but maybe from home you can just thank Michelle Merriweather, David Wertheimer, Skelchum Kelmendi, and Asa Tate. Just thank you all, and you can kind of wave your hands from home even if they can't see you. We're excited. So thank you for joining us for Unhoused. Stay tuned for new dates in the new year and new programs. We're excited to keep growing the Well Connected series, and I thank our panelists, and I thank you for joining us. Take good care.